Day two dawns with some of the funnier stories. The theme has been set of stories of people who have suffered many misfortunes to be rewarded in the end. They are happy at the end of their story. And the stories themselves are all kind of funny in the way that they have twists and turns of fate, and you get great comic scenes. But the way it adds up, it seems like this is a very pat little. You can make an awful lot of trite stuff out of a theme like that. Happily ever after stories, and the idea of the person who suffers is rewarded, and that sense of an orderly universe. And you can see in the casting of this theme, it seems to be trying to lean in that direction and come up with an excuse to tell stories that, well, yes, the world does make sense because the meek shall inherit the earth in a Christian construction. It is about rewarding a kind of patience and virtue. And you can see how this would be attractive to a group of people who were suffering through the plague and just having to wait it out. The first story is very funny. It's about a group of essentially three con men who hear about an old man, a German from out of town, living in the town of, I believe, Treviso, has died, and his body has become a kind of holy relic. People are going to see it, and they're claiming that miracles are happening because they're coming in contact with it. And okay, whatever. So they say, hey, this sounds like something where we can maybe make a buck. We have a lot of gullible people gathering together. So they come up with the plan that, okay, we're going to go and we're going to pretend that one of us is a cripple, and the other two will help him in, and then miraculously the paralyzation will cure, and with contact with the body, and they'll just get rewarded for that somehow. And they do this, and things don't go according to plan, and they are discovered. And the two who had helped, I believe his name is Martellino. Martellino is the one who went up and pretended to be a cripple. He said, well, I can bend my legs all sorts of funny ways. And you can just see like him going up and hamming it up and, and being very cheesy. And, it's almost made for TV. It's just, it's so goofy. But they're discovered. Martellino is seized. The other two run off. And Martellino is then essentially pounced on by an angry mob who begin to beat him. He is saved from death by being essentially dragged in front of the court. He's arrested, and he is charged, and he is tortured to get a confession, and it's looking fairly grim. But his friends, who had run off, perhaps understandably in fear and panic, human reaction, they go and they find this guy who is said that he has a relationship with the judge or something like that. And he can maybe go and talk to someone. And so they come back in, and he arranges for Martellino to get a chance to talk to the judge and basically just tell his story. And he lays it out, and the judge just, the judge, it turns out, has, it says, the judge just happened to have some sort of grudge against Florentines, which is interesting because it shows a kind of human motivation behind the persecution. It's not necessarily God punishing anybody, Martellino, but it is just a human, pettiness, perhaps. We don't know what the grudge was, but it was a human motivation, not divine. But upon hearing the story, he reacts again in a very human way, and he laughs. He laughs, human laughter. And because he thinks the story is so funny, and these guys are clearly just a couple of idiots, he lets him off the hook. The three of them, beyond anything they could have expected, all three of them escaped from their terrible ordeal and returned home safe and sound. And it all worked out in the end. Was it really an ordeal? Was it really like a trial by God or anything like that? I mean, they're just a couple of con men who are trying to score on the rubes. But they get through it because of, again, human connections. The judge, who on the one hand was very harsh because he had this animus towards Florentines, being from a rival city, but on the other hand, he laughs and he sees the humor and he sees the common humanity then, and he all right, fine, get out. It's funny, and it gives you that basic theme of human connection again. Story 2, another very funny one about a merchant. You get a lot of merchants and thieves, quite frequent in Decameron, but a merchant who is traveling, and he is essentially robbed, mugged, and left for dead. And he's stripped naked in the cold, and he wanders over to this lavish house that he sees, and it's on the outskirts of this. It's inside the city. He can't get into the city because the city, medieval city, has been locked up at night. It's dangerous outside, so they have walls around the city, so security. He can't get in. It's too late. So he's just sort of sitting there, huddling, trying not to freeze to death. And the noise of his whimpering, supposedly, attracts the attention of the maid in a fairly nice house, just on the wall, essentially. And she goes and she tells her mistress, whose house this is, that, there's a young guy down there. He looks like he's about to die. And the woman says, okay, go get him, bring him in. Now, this woman had been waiting up. She had been waiting for a visit from the city, the local marquis, who she is his lover. But he has stood her up, and she's just sitting around like, I got all dressed up, I cleaned up, I laid out a nice supper. He was going to come by. We were going to have a little fun for the evening. But, he's a no-show. Women love that. So they bring in the young guy. They clean him up. They give him a bath. They give him something to eat. And, and he's slowly, he's basically on death's door when they bring him in. But he kind of thaws out and gets a little comfortable. And the woman, who is a widow, importantly, she's not just a slut. She's looking him up and down and saying, that's interesting. Yeah, he's looking pretty good. Now, significantly, I should say also that the merchant, whose name is Ronaldo had spoken to his assailants for a little while. They had, again, people just fall together and they seem like good guys, so they struck up a conversation. And he says that, well, I never fear of anything because I always say my prayers, and my prayers are always answered in that I am always kept safe. I never leave my lodgings in the morning without saying an Our Father and a Hail Mary for the souls of St. Julian's father and mother. After that, I pray to the saint himself and to God to send me good lodging on the night to come. So, and the thief says, yeah, sure. See if your God helps you now. And that's when they pounce and they strip him and rob him and run off. And so he is, this is a spiritual shaking for him that, I said my prayers and all of this happened to me. This is terrible. But this beautiful woman is now saving me, and she's giving him something to eat, cleaned him up, put him in a nice suit of clothes for a little while. She's giving him the look, and she had been waiting for her lover, the Marquis, to come by, and she was a little disappointed, a little miffed, but it's a cold night, gotta stay warm. And she said very significantly, or she thought to herself, apart from any morality of cheating on the Marquis or anything, who has a wife and was probably cheating with her on whatever, but he said, she thought to herself, it is a good idea to make use of the gift that Fortune had sent her. Fortune, not God. Fortune is a pagan influence and sort of a goddess of luck, fate. Wild things happen, and they are sort of put on Fortune. Fortune is sort of an element of chaos as opposed to God, who's supposed to be reminiscent of a kind of a divine order. Everything makes sense, everything happens the way it's supposed to happen, and it is all perfectly logical. Fortune is the antithesis of that. But she's saying, it's cold, he's nice, let's go. And so she starts putting the moves on him, and he goes along with it. And you get a little humpity in that cold evening, and he's got nowhere better to go, so they have a very nice little evening together. And the next morning, he gets dressed. She gave him some clothes, and he goes back out into the city. And he happens to see that the robbers that had jumped him had been caught for something else, and they returned all of his. He went and he claimed, said, "Yeah, those guys robbed me too. This is my story." And they returned all of his stuff to him, except for a couple of garters. Which I think is a sexual thing, like missing your garters, huh? They let him have all of his stuff, and he goes on his happy way, reaching a good end in the end. The story ends in a very pointed way. Thus it was that Rinaldo, giving thanks to God and St. Julian, the logic of the world, mounted his horse and returned home safe and sound, whereas the next day the three bandits were left kicking their heels in the north wind. That's it. They were hung. Their fate was very harsh. Now you can say that they deserved it. They were criminals. They, perhaps did other things. But that's just a harsh note to end on, whereas he feels very good about himself. And, it's a divine, logical world after all, giving thanks to God and St. Julian for listening to my prayers and keeping me safe. Was it God who did that, or was it just the human kindness of the widow and the maid who saw him and said, yeah, let's take him in. He's gonna, he looks pathetic out there. Was it human motivation, or was it divine inspiration? It seems to be leaning here very heavily on the human argument, the argument that God is nowhere near this. There's a serious division between them. Story 3, also very funny in many ways, less funny. It's essentially a retelling of the biblical Joseph and his brothers story. Wealthy people squander their money and betray one of their these 3 brothers who inherit a lot of money, squander it all, and they betray their nephew. The nephew ends up attached to. He finds his way to England. He ends up attached to the house of, or he finds his way to Belgium. Sorry, finds his way and finds himself attached to this retinue that is escorting a young man to go visit the Pope. A young man attached to the royal family of England, and he falls in with them, and he's very well educated, and he's very cultivated, so he can charm his way in. And then he, it turns out, in a somewhat suggestive little homoerotic thing, that when he spends a little time alone with this the leader of this group, who is supposed to be the young man, he gets a little warm and feely in that. And it turns out, of course, that the young man is actually a woman traveling as a man in disguise to protect her identity and go visit the Pope. But of course, they fall in love. He gets married to her. He becomes the right-hand man to the King of England, and restores his family, including the 3 uncles who betrayed him, to great wealth. And it goes specifically to say, that there are those who maintain that partly through his own ability and intelligence, and partly with the help of his father-in-law, he later conquered Scotland and was crowned her king. Again, human connections, native talent through his intelligence and ability, and he has a powerful family now, and it's not all divinely inspired. It's not all a subject of God's grace. It's a story of almost divine indifference in the face of great tribulations and a chaotic world, and it just works out a certain way. Story 4, also another funny one. Another merchant. He invests heavily and in merchandise that he learns through the market. Everybody else has on the market at that moment has the same merchandise, so he has to sell everything off at a bargain just to unload it, and he loses his shirt. Essentially, he loses everything, and he decides that, well, I don't want to be poor, but I have this ship that I used to buy all this stuff, and I just unloaded it. I'm going to use that ship, and I'm going to go be a pirate. Pirates. You get his stories of him going around and raiding and stealing and doing all this stuff, and he gets captured. He gets freed. He gets wrecked in a storm, and when he's drifting around in the water, he sees like this chest, and at first he's afraid that it's gonna sink him or bottom or bop him in the head or something, so he keeps pushing it away. But then, oh no, okay, everything else is sinking, so he has to grab onto the chest, and he washes ashore, clinging to the chest as a kind of a life raft. And a woman finds him. A woman nurses him back to health. A woman takes care of him. And he goes and he looks in the chest, and of course it's loaded with precious jewels, money beyond his imaginings. And he's grateful. He sends a so-called tidy sum of money to the woman and to another group of people that had helped him along the way. But he thanked God. He credits God for restoring him to wealth and glory. And it ends, again, beginnings and endings, it ends, and then abandoning any thought of being a merchant, he kept the rest of the money and was able to live on it, becoming prosperity for the rest of his life. He kept the rest of the money, which shows that, okay, he survived and he came to a comfortable end after many tribulations, but, he was a criminal for a lot of that. So the tribulations are, maybe there's a moral thing going on there. I don't know. But it says that he kept the money. Now, everything he had, he owed to that woman and to another little group of people that gave him some clothes and a horse after he left the woman. He would have nothing without them. He would have been dead. But it says, he gave them, I'm going to give you a little something, but I'm going to keep most of it. Kept most of the money. That's the note they end on. Kept most of the money. Is that an orderly divine universe? I'm not so sure. Story 5, very funny. More mishaps. A young merchant comes to, where are we here? To Naples, southern Italy, and he wanders around some of the dicier areas. He's there to trade in horses. He comes with a big wad of cash, and he's kind of the rube from the sticks who's suddenly like wandering around with money, and people are gonna pounce. And this woman sees him and takes him back to her place, and it's in kind of a shady part of town, and all the hints all over the place are that this is a prostitute. But she brings him into her place. They have some very suggestive talk, but it soon turns out, as she says, that she is his long-lost sister that he never knew he had. And okay, and they weave this crazy story, and he's just sitting there buying all of it. And at a certain point, after a nice big dinner, she gives him a nice dinner. He says, well, okay, I gotta use the men's room. So she says, oh, okay, just go through that door there. And he goes and he steps out, and it's on kind of a ledge, and he ends up falling down to the ground floor, in a sense of it being like 2 or 3 stories up, down to the ground floor into essentially her cesspool, where they would empty their toilet. And so he's, you can see this, he's just filthy and disgusting. And he calls up to her, hello, took a wrong step. And there's no response. And he starts shouting, and the neighbors are getting mad and say, hey, shut up, you're making noise down there. It's a very rough neighborhood. And so, he goes around to the front, he starts pounding on the door, hello, let me in. He's basically naked at this point. He's covered in filth, and he's he's not getting what happened until, like, her pimp starts yelling at him and saying, if you don't get out of here, I'm gonna kill you. And it slowly, very slowly, starts to dawn on him that maybe she's not his sister. Maybe this isn't how it was. Maybe this isn't really how he thought it was. And so he just sort of, with nowhere else to go, they're not opening the door. All of his money that he came with to trade horses with, to buy horses with, all of his money is gone. She's got it all. So he wanders out, and he's just sort of wandering around the town, the bad part of town, and he falls in with a couple of criminals. And they say, hey, you can help us. We got a job to do. And it turns out that they are on their way to go rob the grave of an archbishop who had just died. And they had heard that he had died with and was being buried with some very precious jewels. Fairly common crime in that time. People would dress up the fancy people before they put them in a box, and then after the burial, night falls and people come dig up the hole, and hey, you're not going to need this ring anymore, are you? So they're planning to do this, but they're walking through town. They realize, oh my God, this guy stinks. He's covered in, and it's just making him gag. So, all right, we got to go get cleaned up. We got to get you cleaned up. So they go and they go to a well, which is really gross and unsanitary. But they start trying to pull up some water. The rope is broken, or there's no bucket. So it basically, there are people coming by. The two criminals that he's with do not want any attention. They don't want to run into anyone. So they're getting very anxious and impatient. And so basically they just throw him in the well. Which again is really disgusting for the water supply, but at least it cleans him off. But when he finally manages to climb back out of the well, because remember there's sort of a problem with the rope, he looks around and nobody's there. Another group had come by and scared off the robbers, so they had ditched him, literally, in another ditch. This is the second ditch, wet, disgusting, dark thing that he has had to pull himself out of. This one makes him a little cleaner, at least. But, once again, he is alone. He is no longer, filthy, but he's still wet. And, he's just wandering through the streets, again, wearing pretty much nothing but a nightshirt. He's wandering along, and who's he run into? The same two crooks again. And they say, oh, good, there you are. They left him, so, it's not that surprising. But they bring him along and say, all right, now we're going to do the job. So they go to the tomb, and they pull one of the stones out from it, just enough for somebody who's very skinny to crawl in to the crypt. And of course, it's going to be our friend, the merchant, who, objects at first. He doesn't want to do it, but no, you'll get it. He goes in, he immediately finds the one item that they're really curious about, which is a very precious ring on the corpse's finger, and he says, well, I'm starting to not trust these guys. Like he had any reason to trust them at all. So he pockets the ring himself, but he starts throwing out other stuff that he finds there, all the other stuff that, the archbishop probably won't be needing. But when he does, He throws all that stuff out, and he hears, suddenly the stone is replaced, and he is locked in there. And the other two take all the treasure and run off. And he's locked in there, and he's like, oh my God, the third dark, damp, miserable, suffering place that he has been, stuck in this evening. And he's sitting there, he's like, oh, I'm going to die. The fumes from the body are going to kill me, which is an old medieval belief. And I'm going to, I'm going to die of hunger or something, whatever. Yeah, it's got to be very frightening. But son of a gun, he starts to hear voices outside where his friends were, and it turns out that there is another group of crooks who were coming to rob the same corpse. It's a good idea, I guess. A thriving business model. And they pull out the stone, and they start having the same argument. Well, okay, who's going to go in there? And one of whom, who is identified as a priest robbing the grave of an archbishop, the priest starts to all right, I'll do it. And he gets he starts to back himself in leg first, and the merchant sees the legs coming in, and he just sort of reaches out and grabs him and starts to try and pull him in. And can you imagine? Can you imagine the nightmares that this will spawn for the rest of that priest's life? And the priest starts screaming, the other two start screaming, and they run off. The priest starts screaming, kicking, and breaks free, and he gets out and runs off, presumably to never do anything like that again, you would think, but you never know. And our merchant friend gets out, and he is he has the ring. They say, happy beyond wildest hopes when you saw what had happened, Andruccio quickly threw himself out of the tomb and left the church. Andruccio is his name. By the way it come in, day was already starting to break as he went wandering aimlessly about with the ring on his finger. Eventually he reached the waterfront, where he stumbled upon his inn and discovered that his companions and the innkeeper had spent the entire night up, worried about what had become of him. His friends, whom he had, come to town with and, parted company with while he went to go take care of business, his friends were worried about him. And he was saying throughout that, well, I should send word to my friends that I'm not going to be home. And he was always told, nah, don't worry about it. Yeah, sure. Forget about that. But that note just keeps getting sounded throughout. And in the end, he finds out, well, yeah, his friends were worried about him. He had a rough night. The night that, quite frankly, would make a great movie. 3-act structure and all. And in the end, he has this ring. So he lost all of his cash in the prostitute's house at the beginning, and now he has essentially recouped that loss. But what he's really got is evidence of, well, okay, the world is harsh out there. The world is cruel. The world is not something to take lightly, and it is very often chaotic and makes no sense and will toss you in a puddle of shit. But you can always come home to your friends. You can always find that connection, that human value beyond all the chaos. it makes it easier to get through the chaos if you just remember that. If you remember that all of this wild twists of fate, all of these incomprehensible acts of God, they are tolerable if you have friends, if you have human connections that you can make with people you trust. And again, that's what these people telling stories are doing. They have struck up a little community that is very much aware of the chaos outside with the plague, that they are huddling together and trying to give each other some comfort, trying to share something human to get through the incomprehensible chaos of a hostile world. It's no accident that this is the theme of this second day. Very early, it's the first established theme that they all follow. It is significant in that you have a sense of it being, it's sort of set up to be kind of a, a charming little parable after parable of God's grace and how in the end everything works out okay. But in the end, it's almost chaos, or it just happens to work out. There's no sense in any of these stories that it's really God working things out in a way of divine intervention or divine logic. It's just random and at times terrifying. But they always have one another to get through.